No one could have predicted what would unfold on Flight 302. It seemed like any other commercial flight, a mix of passengers, some dozing off, others reading their books. But in the middle of it all sat a young man, calmly adjusting his seatbelt, completely unaware of the storm brewing around him. He was a white-skinned passenger, wearing a bright red cap with the bold letters MAGA emblazoned across the front. Most passengers didn't give him a second glance, assuming he was just another face in the crowd. But one person did notice. One person's eyes narrowed as she walked down the aisle, the flight attendant. Her name was Sarah. She had worked for the airline for years, her eyes constantly scanning the cabin, judging every detail. And as her gaze landed on the young man's hat, something inside her snapped. The hat reminded her of something she despised, what it represented. As Sarah approached, her steps quickened. The tension in the air was palpable, but the young man, oblivious to what was coming, simply stared out the window. No one could have guessed that this seemingly innocent interaction would soon escalate into a confrontation that would captivate the entire plane. "Excuse me, sir." Sarah's voice cut through the calm air of the cabin. Her tone was clipped, her posture stiff. "But that hat," she began, pointing directly at the young man's red cap. "It's against airline policy." The young man turned toward her, blinking in surprise. His expression was a mix of confusion and mild curiosity. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice soft, almost innocent. Sarah's lips tightened. "That hat," she repeated, her voice rising slightly. "It's not appropriate. We don't allow any political statements or controversial symbols on board." Her eyes flashed with a judgment that seemed to pierce through the young man. The passengers around them shifted uncomfortably. Some glanced at each other, sensing the tension that was building. The young man's calm demeanor only seemed to fuel Sarah's frustration. He wasn't reacting the way she expected. "I'm sorry, but I don't see how it's a problem," he said, still looking confused. The conversation might have ended there, but Sarah wasn't done. There was something about the way he wore that hat, something about his seemingly effortless defiance. To her, it wasn't just a piece of clothing. It was a symbol, one that represented everything she disagreed with. And that made it personal. "You don't understand," Sarah said, her voice tinged with anger. "It's not just about the hat. It's about respect. Respect for the rules, and for the people around you." She glanced around the cabin, as though seeking silent support from the passengers. The young man frowned. "It's just a hat," he said quietly. His calm response seemed to frustrate Sarah even more. She was used to people complying, to people apologizing for minor infractions. But this time, there was no apology. There was only quiet resistance. Sarah took a deep breath, her temper rising. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her now, but her focus remained fixed on the young man. The tension in the cabin had become almost suffocating, and everyone seemed to be waiting for the next move. For a few moments, the only sound in the cabin was the soft hum of the airplane's engines. Sarah and the young man stared at each other, two people locked in a silent battle of wills. The young man's calm gaze didn't falter. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't become defensive. He was simply sitting there, not reacting in the way Sarah had hoped. She was growing more agitated by the second. She had expected him to apologize, to remove the hat, to make it easy on her. But instead, he was looking at her as if she were the one out of place. His stillness, his quiet resistance, was starting to get under her skin. Around them, the other passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some glanced at their phones, others pretended not to notice, but everyone was aware of the drama unfolding before them. The flight attendant, once so composed, now seemed agitated, and the young man, far from being intimidated, seemed more resolved than ever. Finally, Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She had been patient, tried reasoning with him, but now her frustration boiled over. Without warning, she reached out and grabbed the young man's hat, pulling it off his head. The movement was so sudden, so forceful, that it caught everyone by surprise. The young man blinked, momentarily stunned by the action. His hand instinctively reached up to touch his head, but he didn't say a word. Sarah, now holding the hat in her hands, looked at it with disdain. She had won, at least in her mind. But as she stood there, her victory felt hollow. She looked at the young man, waiting for him to react. Surely he would protest now. But the young man didn't move. He didn't say anything. Instead, he simply looked at her, his face a mask of quiet disbelief. The flight attendant, still holding the hat, stood in front of him, waiting for something, anything, to make this moment feel like a win. The cabin was filled with tension. The other passengers sat frozen, unsure of what would happen next. Some had been recording the scene discreetly, their phones held up just out of sight. The quiet murmur of whispers grew louder as the passengers processed what had just happened. No one spoke up. No one dared to challenge the authority of the flight attendant, but everyone could feel the discomfort. The young man hadn't reacted, hadn't fought back. He simply accepted the insult, leaving Sarah standing with the hat in her hand. It was clear now. This wasn't just about a piece of clothing anymore. It was about something deeper, something personal. The young man's lack of reaction was what unsettled everyone the most. He wasn't afraid, wasn't humiliated. Instead, he sat there, quiet and composed, as though waiting for something more. Sarah, meanwhile, felt a pang of unease. Had she overstepped? Had she gone too far? As Sarah stood there, holding the hat in her hands, something unexpected happened. The young man, who had been silent this whole time, finally spoke. "Are you done?" His voice was calm, but there was a definite edge to it now. The passengers around them held their breath. What would happen next? Sarah hesitated. The young man's words hung in the air like a challenge. She had been in control up until now, but the tables had turned. She hadn't expected him to speak, let alone question her actions. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," he said, his voice still steady. "I just wanted to wear my hat." Sarah could feel the heat in her cheeks now. She had crossed a line. The passengers who had been watching intently were now waiting for her response. The moment of confrontation had arrived, and the flight attendant didn't know what to say. What happened next caught everyone off guard. The young man leaned forward and calmly called over the flight attendant's supervisor. The passengers exchanged glances, surprised. No one expected him to make a move like this. Was he calling for backup? Was this about to escalate further? But the flight attendant's supervisor arrived moments later, a calm presence amidst the tension. The young man explained the situation, his voice measured but firm. Sarah stood there, awkwardly, holding the hat in her hands. The supervisor listened, nodding, then turned to Sarah. Without saying a word, she handed the hat back to the young man. The passengers looked on in silence. They had witnessed something they hadn't expected, a quiet moment of resistance, a shift in power. And now, the flight attendant who had been so sure of herself was left standing with nothing to say. As the young man put his hat back on, he looked up at Sarah. The tension in the air had dissipated, but the words still hung between them. "Next time," he said calmly, "maybe you'll think before you make someone feel small." Sarah didn't respond. What could she say? She had lost. In front of everyone, she had been shown up by a young man who had done nothing but remain calm and composed throughout the ordeal. The cabin was quieter now, the drama slowly fading. But it wasn't forgotten. The passengers were talking amongst themselves, murmuring about what had just happened. For Sarah, the lesson was clear. Power wasn't just about authority. It was about respect, about knowing when to step back and when to stand your ground. As the plane landed, the passengers began to exit, some still discussing the events that had unfolded. The young man walked off the plane, his head held high, his hat proudly perched on his head. Sarah remained in the cabin for a moment longer, reflecting on what had happened. She had learned something that day, something important about respect, about humility, and about how power can shift in an instant. The moment had passed, but the lesson would stay with her. And as for the young man, he had made his point without raising his voice, without anger. In the end, it wasn't the hat that mattered. It was how you carried yourself that counted the most. The passengers might have moved on, but Sarah would never forget the quiet confrontation that had taught her more than any rule ever could.